Well, thank you so much for joining us and giving us a little bit of your time. And so you like to be called Rich?
Usually Rick.
Oh, Rick, okay. Rick, and how
Yes.
do you pronounce your last name?
Raushenbush.
Raushenbush, okay, just like it sounds. But I always ask people
Exactly.
because you never know.
I think that's fair.
Okay, so thank you very much, Rick Raushenbush, for being with us and having this conversation today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Sure, sure. And so your connection, your most notable, I guess, connection to the National Civic League is, of course, that you are the great-grandson, only one great.
Only one
great-grandson of Louis Brandeis. And so would love to start off just talking about that. So thinking about some of the early pioneers and founders of the National Civic League, Louis Brandeis, Teddy Roosevelt, Frederick Law Olmsted. I'm almost tempted to say, what would they do today? So what's been some of your thinking about connecting where we are now with the history of the founding of the League and some of their progressive philosophy in terms of government and good governance? So that's a big question, and you can go wherever you want with that.
It is a good question, and as you say, a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I do occasionally go back and read
Mm-hmm.
things that Justice Brandeis said,
Mm-hmm.
as
Yep.
well as Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano
Mm-hmm.
Roosevelt,
Mm-hmm.
because they are still so opposite today.
Mm-hmm.
We're facing a lot of similar difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
We have new difficulties as well, but some of them are quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
The incredible disparity in wealth and income in this country were exactly what they faced early in the progressive era with the Gilded Age and monopolistic practices.
Right.
And there were waves of immigration coming at that time, and people who were already here looked down upon those who were coming and felt they were going to dilute American values. And of course, that turned out not to be the case.
Right.
And what the progressive people did during that time period was somewhat similar to what is argued for now, which is it's a lot of engagement, building support, and frankly, pretty plodding work to garner supporters, pressure legislators, create transparency about some of the conduct at that time in order to get laws changed or laws passed to improve the conditions of people at the time. So on the one hand, it doesn't make me think anything is easy to change because it wasn't easy in the early 1900s either.
Right.
But on the other hand, it makes me feel like a lot of these efforts to reinvigorate the same kind of democracy with a little d that we're seeing now, hopefully will have a similar impact.
Yeah, I love talking to people that have that historical context because it just reminds us that history is cyclical and that things ebb and flow, and we do face a lot of the same challenges over and over again. So I really appreciate that perspective.
It's very easy to get caught up in the daily tweet or the daily news about the daily tweet. And in reality, these things, not that things can't change in modern society in a heartbeat, but a lot of these issues are longer term. If you look at them in the arc of history, they're not unusual and they can be overcome.
Well, I know that one of the things that you've talked about, speaking of that, that historical, sort of repetitiveness in a good way, is the need for leaders to find a balance between individual responsibility and community responsibility, kind of the tension between the conservative and the progressive in a lot of ways. So what are some key ways you think, and that you've talked about, that community leaders can really find that balance and promote more civic engagement to address some of the community responsibilities as well as the individual?
Yeah, I think that's difficult. Balance, nobody's satisfied with balancing, right? Because if the balancing goes against you, you're usually not happy about it.
Exactly.
On the other hand, it's almost always necessary because things aren't black and white, and depending upon what the facts are, there may be, the course you should take is different. So, as I have expressed, I think that people, if you sort of start from a view that you have a individual responsibility to take care of yourself and your family, that is in fact part of how you pitch into your community, as you are taking care of your part of the community. But not everybody can. And that means that sometimes you need to be willing to help other people. And the level of assistance that's needed will depend upon the facts of that circumstance. And that's where leaders need to both be, resolute enough to sometimes say, this is not a governmental problem. It is something that, as Americans, we can handle ourselves. That's a problem you can solve. And other times you look at it and you say, okay, there's something wrong that government can provide the response for. So for example, in the economic realm, it is the job of government to sort of set the rules for how markets function, how competitors act within those markets. We have rules on monopolies, we have antitrust rules, we have, you're not, these days, it wasn't always this way, you can't sell, poisonous food. It used to be, well, you'll figure that out after you buy it, and you won't buy it again. Well, we don't allow that anymore. I mean, that's the benefits of having all these agencies and regulations about environmental protection, food safety, highway safety, all this sort of thing. So there are places where the government should step in. And it's a balance because you don't want to step in every single time. And not everything can be legislated. On the other hand, I think that, part of what we're seeing here is that even when a governmental solution would be appropriate, there are people who are arguing that it should be an individual problem because they're concerned about, the impact on them. I don't want to pay for someone else. I don't want to pay taxes to help someone else. And that's just not consistent with what has been American values in the past and what I think should be our values.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, you did ask about civic engagement.
I did, but...
So I think what I spent some time, 8 years on our school board, which is a pretty low-level governmental agency, but you do have an opportunity to find out about civic engagement.
Yes.
Because if there's anything that gets parents interested, it's their children. And one of the ways that we found was very effective was actually if you ask people to do more, so the people who come and raise an issue in front of the school board, if you ask them to contribute more, it's helpful. And so we had a lot of advisory committees where, okay, you have a concern about the math curriculum? Great, you can be on the math advisory committee. Now you can listen to the viewpoints of 5 or 6 different experts, and you help weigh which is the best path to go. Or if you want to talk about the budget, here's the million things we have competing for a finite amount of money. You tell us how you'd weigh it now that you're not just advocating for your one school and your one program in that one school. And we found that essentially people are much more understanding and open when they suddenly put themselves in a decision maker's shoes and have to consider all of the variables. So I think that is a way to effectively bring people in.
I love that because it, you know, when people, a lot of times this notion of engagement is about just asking people their opinions and then it goes into a vacuum, right? But when you
Exactly.
give people decision-making power and authority and accountability, that raises the game.
That's right. If people just think you're going through the motions of hearing them, you don't get any credit for that.
Right. Well, so speaking of credit, this touches on a couple of things, credit and also government stepping in. Thinking a little bit about the federal government versus the role of state and local government. So, you know, Justice Brandeis once said that states were laboratories of democracy. And we've heard a lot recently about cities being laboratories of democracy potentially, especially as the federal government is stepping back in some of those traditional areas. So what do you think about cities and regions being laboratories of democracy? How is that working? How is that not working? What are some of the things that are important, that would be important if they are to be laboratories of democracy?
I think that cities and regions, just like states, can perform the same function. So when Justice Brandeis referred to the ability of states to, if a courageous state and its citizens so choose, they can attempt social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. So in other words, you can try out a potential solution to a problem. If it works, fantastic, everyone can copy it. If it doesn't work, it's only affected your one location, and you can abandon it. And it has worked out really well, I think, in many cases. One that, or two that were really, I think, clear were unemployment compensation, which started in Wisconsin, then spread to other states, became a federal law, and ameliorated the risk for working people that a short-term unemployment would lead to financial ruin. And then California, for its own reasons, because of the smog that it had in the 1970s, created this program of controlling vehicle emissions. And that was then recognized when the federal government finally got around to the Clean Air Act, and other states were given the opportunity to opt into whatever California's emission standards were, and nearly half the states have done that. So those are examples of things that have spread. So when cities are operating now, they have somewhat more local problems, but they have a lot of authority within the city. And one of the areas that's particularly on my mind, I think every city in the Bay Area, is homelessness. And it has been an intractable problem.
Just talking about that with someone today.
I mean, the amount of, it's really not for lack of money. I mean, I think San Francisco puts in nearly $500 million a year into trying to help the homeless. Some programs seem to help, some do not. There hasn't been, I think it's a real learning experience, and a lot of different cities are trying out a lot of different programs. So I have hopes that may result in some forward progress, because this is a problem that is throughout the United States, and it's going to have to be dealt with soon. Cities also, at least in the environmental area, have have a fair amount of power through their own purchasing, so they can regulate their own vehicle, their own purchases of power, their own purchases of vehicles, what kind of buildings they construct, who they make loans to, and a lot of cities are doing that, certainly through California and the West. I'm less familiar with the East Coast, but there is a lot of progress being made even in cities. So I think they have the opportunity to do that, and given what seems to be gridlock at the federal level, I think it's imperative that cities and states act.
Great. Any thoughts about the pitfalls potentially, or some challenges around that? I'm thinking about the Paris Climate Accords and cities and communities saying we're going to take an active role because the federal government isn't. There can be some clashing. Just wondering about challenges and any advice you have around avoiding some of those.
Well, it's difficult because there is a perfectly legitimate reason that American businesses would like to have the same regulations apply in every state. So if you're told that, I mean, you can see now where the Trump administration is seeking to roll back fuel efficiency standards, and California has its own. So the industry does not want to build separate cars for California and every state that is following California's standards and other cars for the rest of the country. That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And for the same reason, energy efficiency standards from California that have been adopted by most of the states, you don't want to build a different kind of air conditioner for different places. So companies do have an interest in seeing uniform regulations, and I understand that point of view. I also understand the point of view of some states where, for example, if it is more expensive to build in California or to operate your business in California because of the regulations there, then maybe those companies will leave and go to a state that doesn't put any restrictions on what they put into the atmosphere or into their neighboring waterways. So an absence of environmental regulations creates a competitive disadvantage for states that are more stringent. So you would like to see federal action, but if we can't have it, then we need to act at a more local level. And you're seeing this, the same thing plays out across the world, and that's why you see a lot of, I'm not sure that's the focus of trade negotiations in this administration, but in a lot of other administrations, environmental protections in other countries have been important. We don't want to have strong protections here and everybody moves their businesses to other countries where they don't have those restrictions, and so you're not actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions because they've just moved it to a different country. So it is important that we have these international agreements that create a structure to address global problems through global agreements and rules on what the playing field should be.
Right. So laboratories of innovation at the local level, but the need for some broader oversight. And
not every problem is local.
Right. Perfect summary. And one problem that tends to be local is education. and that's certainly been my area of focus professionally, and your time on the school board, I'm sure you've learned a lot. So any thoughts about some of the challenges and opportunities, some of the main challenges and opportunities that are facing public education right now at the local level? Well,
the challenges are are similar to the opportunities, I guess. First let me say education is probably the best investment that you can make. And if we want to address modern problems and prepare our children to deal in a modern society, we need good education.
I agree.
And the problems are primarily teachers and money. And I think our most parents' own experience, as well as all of the studies that are out there, show how important it is to have high quality teaching for children to have success in school, for them to be interested, for them to learn. So we need teachers who are well trained with tremendous expertise. And it's only been getting harder. It used to be that a lot of school, not all school, but a lot of school was about memorizing various things that had happened. And now under all of the newer standards, like the Common Core standards and the Next Generation Science standards, the focus is really on our children learning to think.
Right.
And so there's research, analyzing, communicating, coordinating, defending your reasoning. And all of this is much more important for modern society. But it is a lot harder, at least it appears from an outsider's point of view, to be a lot harder to teach. And if you probably have, but a lot of people probably have not looked at the actual teaching standards in your states. I looked at California's, and if you thought about trying to organize a lesson that included every item that you're supposed to include on these teaching standards, I think it would take me 100 hours for each lesson because there's so many things you're supposed to incorporate.
Right.
And that's why teachers are trained professionals. So normally we would pay trained professionals at least a living wage. And instead what we've seen is a disinvestment from education. And we don't have enough money in many states, not all. There are some states that are financing education very well, but most do not. And there isn't enough to pay teachers adequately or even keep up with the cost of living. There has been dramatic underfunding of teacher pensions, which part of what teachers accept a lower salary for is that they have this promise of lifetime pension payments eventually. So if that looks at risk, it's also a threat for teachers entering the profession. And then we have, an underinvestment in school facilities, and with, not everywhere, but there is a huge backlog of school facilities that need to be rebuilt. Students and teachers shouldn't have to learn and work in dilapidated facilities, some of which are actually, a threat to their health. So all of these things have resulted in a massive teacher shortage at the same time that we need so many more highly qualified teachers. And this is one of those examples where you can, there's always this desire to do things cost effectively, but cost effective does not mean that anything is free. And if you want good public services, including good public education, people are going to have to pay for it, and that means, it has to be prioritized and taxes have to be committed to it. So I think those are the major challenges, and I think you've seen a little bit in the last few years that there's some built-up frustration among teachers about inadequate pay, and I'm hoping that this pressure is starting to reverse the trend of just cut, because you can't always get everything you want by paying a lot less.
Right. Who thinks you can?
The people who try and convince you that taxes should always be cut and should never be increased. And sometimes they have to be increased.
Yes. For our children.
Exactly.
For our society.
If you're not going to invest in your children, what are you going to invest in?
Yeah. Well, I think my last question goes back to being kind of a broad question, which is, what advice do you have for the National Civic League? One or two pieces of advice at our 125th anniversary?
Wow, that's a good question, because I hardly feel qualified to give advice to some institution that's been around 125 years. I think that a couple of thoughts that I have, one relates probably to my major concern about where we are these days in the country. And I think you can go back to Justice Brandeis or almost everybody since who talks about the ultimate decision makers in this country are educated citizens who are involved in the political process. And what has become much more difficult is people are busy, so it's hard to take time to become educated, but there has been a consistent campaign in recent years to undermine the veracity and trustworthiness of American institutions. And the sense that you don't know what actual facts are anymore, the fact that we have to talk about true facts as opposed to what? Untrue facts? They're not facts, those are lies. And so if the truth is being distorted by lies or defunding of programs to actually collect facts or express disinformation campaigns, it undermines the abilities of people to make good decisions. And the Civic League does a lot to involve people at a local level where you can see with your own eyes. It's harder to be fooled when you're looking at something yourself and that you're experiencing yourself. So the question is, can we take this progress at local levels where we address problems and create credibility for government by solving problems that people know exist because they see them, and convert that into something where there's more trust in a free press and expert scientific institutions to provide us with actual data upon which we can then discuss appropriate solutions. But we have to have agreement on the underlying facts first. So I'd like to see the Civic League work on figuring out how we can restore some trust in information that we're receiving.
Great. I think that's a great charge for us for the next stage of our organization.
And good luck with that.
We'll take up your charge, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Rick Raushenbush.
Great. Thank you very much.
So much for your work, your legacy, and your thoughts and advice for us moving forward.
Great. And thank you again for the opportunity to visit this conference.
Great.